At the family party, while everyone laughed and music played, my parents raised their voices so loudly the whole room froze. They pointed at me and shouted, "Pay $2,000 rent or get out." My chest tightened, but I swallowed my tears. That night, I walked away quietly, and no one imagined how the life they pushed me from would become the life they'd one day envy. The house was full of music, laughter, and the smell of food when suddenly the mood shifted. Mathusi stood up, his voice sharp, and Naladi's eyes followed the room with pride as if they were about to announce something grand. But instead, their words cut through the air like a blade. They looked directly at Lerato, their only daughter, and in front of aunts, uncles, cousins, and neighbors they declared, "From now on you will pay $2,000 rent every month if you want to stay here. If you can't, you must leave our house." The room fell silent. Plates were half raised, spoons frozen in midair. At first, some people thought it was a joke, but Mathusi's stern tone made it clear, it wasn't. Whispers began almost instantly. A cousin covered her mouth to hide a laugh. An uncle shook his head, muttering that times must be hard. One of the neighbors leaned closer to another guest and whispered loud enough for Lerato to hear, "She can't even afford new shoes, how will she pay rent?" The laughter that followed was like nails scratching against her soul. Lerato sat still, her heart pounding so hard it felt like everyone could hear it. She wanted the ground to swallow her whole. She was just 22, still studying, trying to hold herself together. The same parents who once told her she was their pride now treated her as if she was a burden to be announced and shamed publicly. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she forced a smile, one that barely hid the storm raging inside her chest. Her mind raced with memories of birthdays in that same living room, of her mother braiding her hair before school, her father lifting her high when she was a little girl. But now, all those warm moments were being crushed beneath the weight of humiliation. Relatives kept whispering, some pitying her, others mocking, but not one person stood up to defend her. Lerato sat quietly, hands clenched under the table, her dignity fighting to hold on. In that moment, something shifted in her. The hurt was unbearable, but deep inside, a small spark lit. She didn't know how, but she knew this night would not break her. This night would define her. That night, long after the music had faded and the guests had gone home, Lerato sat alone in her room. The walls that once felt like comfort now pressed down on her like a prison. She stared at the familiar space, the little desk where she used to do her homework, the posters she had put up as a teenager, the window where she'd once sat dreaming about her future. But now, everything felt cold, as if her parents' words had drained the warmth out of the house. She pulled out her old duffel bag, the same one she had used in college, and began packing quietly. Each item she folded carried a memory. Her favorite sweater, knitted by her mother when she turned 16. A photo frame of her and her father at a school play, both of them smiling proudly. She paused, holding it in her hands, and for a moment her chest ached with a longing for the love that seemed so far away now. How could the same parents who once cheered the loudest for her achievements now demand she pay rent as if she were a stranger? Her eyes wandered across the room, and every corner whispered a memory. She saw herself as a little girl running through the hallways on her birthday, balloons everywhere, cake on the table. She remembered nights of laughter, family dinners where her father told stories and her mother teased him until they all burst out laughing. But all those memories now felt like glass, shattered by the humiliation of being told to pay or leave. Lerato zipped up the bag slowly, the sound loud in the silence of the night. She walked through the dark hallway, past her parents' closed door. Not a sound came from inside. No one called her name. No one stopped her. She realized, with a deep ache, that her quiet exit meant nothing to them. At the front door, she turned back one last time. She whispered a silent goodbye to the house that raised her, the house she once thought would always be her safe place. Then she stepped out into the cool night air, her bag heavy on her shoulder but her heart heavier still. With each step away, her tears finally fell, but so did something else, an invisible chain. She was walking into the unknown, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never return the same. The first night in her new room, Lerato sat on a thin mattress laid directly on the floor. The walls were cracked, the paint peeling in strips, and the single light bulb above her head flickered as though it might give out at any moment. The air smelled faintly of dampness, and from outside came the distant barking of stray dogs mixed with the noise of old cars rumbling down the street. It was a world far from the comfort she had known. And for the first time, she felt the heavy weight of starting life from nothing. The landlord had shown her the room with little interest, pointing quickly to the small bathroom at the end of the corridor, and reminding her to pay rent on time. She had smiled politely, clutching the few bills she had saved, though inside she wondered how long she could actually manage. Rent, food, transport. It all added up to more than her part-time cafe job could cover. But she told herself she had no choice. This was her new life, and she would have to adapt. Days turned into weeks, and the reality of survival hit harder. She stopped buying new clothes, wearing the same few outfits over and over again. She deleted old shopping apps from her phone, reminding herself that every cent mattered. Nights were the hardest. After long shifts at the cafe, her body tired and her feet aching, she would return to her little room, too exhausted to cook. Most nights it was instant noodles, the cheapest pack she could find at the corner shop, seasoned with nothing more than boiling water and a pinch of hope. Her friends messaged her at times, inviting her to gatherings or nights out, but she always declined, making excuses. The truth was she couldn't afford even a bus fare to see them, let alone the meals they enjoyed together. Slowly, the circle of friends grew distant, and she found herself alone more often than not. But instead of letting the loneliness consume her, she began talking to herself in the quiet, reminding herself that every sacrifice was temporary, every struggle was a step forward. Lorato learned to find strength in the little victories, making rent on time, saving a few coins at the end of the week, surviving another day without giving up. The harsh reality pressed her down, but in her heart, she knew something else. The fire inside her was growing stronger, waiting for the right moment to rise. The whispers began almost immediately after Lorato left her parents' house. At family gatherings, her name was passed around like cheap gossip, carried in hushed tones and mocking laughter. "She won't last," one aunt sneered. "A girl like her? She'll be crawling back, begging for her old bed within weeks." Others chuckled, nodding in agreement, as if they were certain her failure was already written in stone. Even neighbors joined in, shaking their heads when they saw her walk past in the same worn shoes, whispering that pride had made her foolish. Some relatives claimed to care, but even their concern was laced with judgment. "Poor child," they would say, pretending to pity her while adding, "But really, what did she expect? Life is hard." They watched her every move, waiting eagerly for her to stumble, ready to spread the story the moment she returned. In defeat, Lorato heard it all. The voices of doubt followed her like shadows. Sometimes she overheard it directly when she visited the local store, hearing her name slip from someone's lips, accompanied by sly laughter. Other times, messages reached her through mutual friends who thought they were warning her, but instead repeated the cruel words that cut deep. At first, those words stung, pressing against her fragile spirit. At night, when she sat alone in her tiny room, the doubts echoed in her head. What if they were right? What if she really wasn't strong enough? But soon, something inside her shifted. Each cruel remark became fuel for her determination. Instead of breaking her, their disbelief lit a fire in her chest. She told herself quietly, "Let them laugh now. One day, they will have no choice but to respect me." The same voices that tried to push her down became the reason she pushed herself harder. She stopped fearing their mockery and started using it as a mirror of her own strength. If they expected her to crawl back, she would rise higher. If they thought she couldn't survive, she would thrive. Every step she took forward, no matter how small, felt like a silent answer to their gossip. What they didn't realize was that Lorato's silence was not weakness. It was the calm before her storm. And when her storm arrived, it would silence them all. One slow afternoon at the cafe, while Lorato wiped down tables with tired hands, a man sat quietly in the corner, watching her with a thoughtful gaze. His name was Ayatund, a regular customer who always ordered the same black coffee and carried himself with quiet confidence. Unlike others who barely noticed the waitress rushing around, Ayatund paid attention. He saw how Lorato never complained, even when rude customers snapped at her. He noticed how she balanced trays with steady hands despite exhaustion written all over her face. That day, as she brought him his coffee, he smiled warmly and said, "You work harder than most people I know." Lorato blinked in surprise, not used to being seen. She gave a small, tired smile and shrugged, replying softly, "Hard work is all I have right now." Something in her tone, half weary, half determined, caught his heart. He asked her to sit for a moment, and though hesitant, Lorado finally joined him when the cafe grew quiet. Ayatun introduced himself as someone who ran workshops and mentorship programs for young people. Then he leaned forward and said words that made Lorado's chest tighten with hope. "You have the spirit of someone who refuses to quit. That's rare. Don't waste it here. Have you ever thought about digital skills, marketing, freelancing, online work?" Lorado shook her head. She had barely enough money for rent and food, let alone training. Seeing her hesitation, Ayatun smiled kindly. "Don't worry about money. There's a program I can get you into. All I ask is that you promise me one thing. Don't give up on yourself." Her eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. For so long, people had only spoken of her failures, expecting her downfall. This was the first time someone saw her potential, not her struggle. She nodded quickly, whispering, "I promise." That single moment became a spark. A stranger's belief lit a fire that Lorado thought had died. The cafe walls that once felt like a cage suddenly felt like the starting line of a race she was meant to run. What Ayatun didn't know was that his kindness had just shifted the entire direction of her life. Lorado's days became a blur of movement, sacrifice, and determination. She woke before dawn to prepare for her cafe shift, tying her apron tightly even when her body begged for rest. She would smile at customers, balance trays, and wipe down tables until her feet ached. Then, when others went home to sleep, she would open her old laptop in her tiny rented room, the glow of the screen lighting her weary face. The silence of the night became her classroom. At first, the lessons felt overwhelming. Words like SEO, analytics, and campaign strategy sounded foreign, almost impossible to grasp. Many nights she fell asleep on her desk, waking with lines from her notebook imprinted on her skin. But Lorado refused to stop. Whenever doubt crept in, she remembered Ayatun's voice. "Don't give up on yourself." That sentence became her fuel, her anchor when the work seemed too much. Weeks turned into months, and small victories started to appear. She finished her first online project, helping a small business promote their clothing line on social media. The pay was modest, barely enough to cover a week's rent, but it was money she earned through knowledge, not just tired hands. When she received the payment notification, tears ran down her cheeks. It wasn't just money, it was proof that she was capable of building something greater. Slowly, her nights of study became nights of work. Clients began to notice her effort and sincerity. She treated every project, no matter how small, like it was the most important thing she'd ever done. One satisfied client led to another, and soon her name began circulating in small freelance circles. Lorado balanced both worlds, the cafe by day, freelancing by night. She was exhausted, but it was a good exhaustion, the kind that whispered of progress. She cut back on instant noodles and treated herself to real meals occasionally, not as luxury, but as a quiet celebration of her climb. For the first time since leaving her parents' house, Lorado felt a new kind of pride blooming within her. It wasn't loud or showy. It was the silent strength of a woman building her future, one step at a time, refusing to break even when the world expected her to. Lorado's world began to change in ways she had only dreamed of. What started as small freelance projects slowly turned into something bigger. Her late nights of learning, the endless cups of cheap coffee, and the moments of pushing through exhaustion began to pay off. Clients from different countries started noticing her work. One morning, she opened her inbox to find a message from a company overseas offering her a contract that paid more than she had ever earned in a month at the cafe. She read the email 3 times, her hands trembling, hardly believing it was real. With every new project, her confidence grew. She no longer felt like the girl begging for survival. She was a professional, someone people trusted to deliver results. Money began to flow in steadily, and for the first time, she could breathe without fear of the next rent payment. The small victories stacked into milestones, and she realized she had built a career with her own hands. The first thing Lorado did was move out of her tiny, damp room. She found a modest but clean apartment in a safer neighborhood, with sunlight streaming through the windows in the morning. Standing in her new space, she ran her fingers over the walls and whispered to herself, "This is mine. I earned this." It wasn't just about comfort. It was about dignity, about reclaiming the life that once felt stolen from her. But Lorado didn't stop at building for herself. She remembered the nights she cried with hunger, the shame of not having enough, and the sting of cruel whispers. That memory became her compass. She began setting aside part of her income to support charities that helped struggling students. Young people who, like her, were overlooked and abandoned but still carried dreams inside them. She donated books, paid for tuition fees, and even mentored a few students who reminded her of her younger self. The same community that once mocked her now spoke of her with admiration. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was lifting others as she climbed. Lorado had turned her pain into purpose, and her scars into stepping stones. The girl who once left her home with nothing but a small bag was now building a future, so bright it lit the path for others behind her. Back in the house where Lorado had once been humiliated, things were no longer the same. Mathusi's business was failing. Deals that once brought him money now slipped through his fingers, and the lavish lifestyle he and Naledi flaunted began to crumble. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter. The refrigerator grew emptier each week, and the very relatives who once praised them started keeping their distance. The loud laughter that once filled their home was now replaced by tense silences and bitter arguments. Naledi, who had always loved showing off in designer clothes and expensive jewelry, now found herself pawning pieces quietly, hoping no one would notice. But people did. Neighbors whispered, "Have you heard? Things aren't going well for them." The gossip spread quickly, just like it once had about Lorado. Only this time, it was Mathusi and Naledi at the center of ridicule. Despite their struggles, pride held them captive. They never spoke Lorado's name, but her presence was everywhere in the whispers they couldn't escape. At community gatherings, people casually mentioned, "Lorado just signed another international contract," or, "Did you see the car she's driving now?" Each word was like salt on an open wound. Mathusi would clear his throat, pretending not to care, while Naledi forced a smile, even though her heart twisted in jealousy. At night, when no one was watching, Mathusi would sit alone in the living room, his head in his hands. The image of Lorado's face the night he shamed her in front of everyone haunted him. He remembered the forced smile she wore, the way her eyes glistened with unspoken pain. Deep down he knew he had pushed her away, and now, she was rising without him. Naledi too felt the weight. She often stared at her reflection, asking herself how the girl they had dismissed so easily could now be the one everyone admired. But still, neither of them could bring themselves to pick up the phone or knock on Lorado's door. Pride was their prison. They told themselves, "She'll come back eventually." Yet the truth they refused to admit was clear. Lorado wasn't coming back in shame. She was moving forward, stronger, while they were stuck in the quicksand of their own choices. Months later, the family decided to host another big gathering. The same living room that once echoed with Lorado's humiliation was now filled with chatter, clinking glasses, and the smell of food. But this time, the whispers weren't about who brought the best dish or who wore the nicest outfit. They were about whether Lorado would show up. Many doubted she would. After all, the last time she was here, her parents had thrown her dignity on the floor for everyone to step on. Then, just as the room buzzed with laughter, the front door opened. All heads turned. Lorado stepped in slowly, her presence commanding silence. She wore a simple yet elegant dress, nothing flashy, but the way she carried herself was enough to make jaws drop. Confidence wrapped around her like a crown. She wasn't the timid girl who once swallowed her tears. She was a woman who had rebuilt herself from nothing. Relatives who once mocked her now leaned toward each other, whispering in disbelief. Some smiled awkwardly, others avoided her gaze. Even Mathusi and Naledi froze where they stood, their forced smiles trembling as they tried to act as though they weren't shaken. Lorado greeted everyone calmly, her voice steady, her eyes warm but unshaken. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here to stand in her truth. When the time came for speeches, an uncle joked, "Lorado, last time we saw you, you were asked to pay rent. So tell us, how's life treating you now?" The room erupted in nervous laughter, but Lorado only smiled. She took the microphone, her voice ringing clear. "The rent they demanded from me that night was $2,000. Today, I earn more than that in a single week." Gasps filled the air. A cousin nearly dropped his glass. An aunt clasped her hand over her mouth. Lorado continued, her tone steady. I was pushed out of this house in shame. But that push was the very thing that opened doors I never imagined. I don't resent it. I thank it. The room fell silent. For the first time, Methusi and Naledi couldn't hide behind pride. Their daughter, the one they dismissed, now stood taller than both of them combined. And everyone present knew. The balance of respect had shifted forever. The silence after Lorado's words hung heavy in the air. Her parents, Methusi and Naledi, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For the first time, the confidence they always carried seemed to melt away. Their faces, once full of authority, now looked red with embarrassment. They avoided the eyes of the relatives who were all waiting, watching, holding their breath to see what would happen next. Finally, Methusi cleared his throat, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard. "Lorado, we were wrong," he muttered. Naledi quickly added, "We're sorry. We didn't realize what we were doing to you." Their words weren't loud, but they were heavy, like stones finally being laid down after years of being carried. The entire room watched Lorado. Some expected her to break down in tears. Others thought she might lash out in anger. But instead, she stood there with calmness that only comes from pain turned into power. She looked at them steadily and said, "That night, you gave me two choices, pay or leave. But I chose a third one. I chose to rise." Her voice didn't shake. Every word was clear, cutting through the silence like truth itself. The relatives gasped softly, some nodding in admiration. A few even clapped under their breath, not because of arrogance, but because they had just witnessed strength born out of brokenness. Lorado didn't smile out of spite, but out of peace. She knew in that moment she had closed the door to the pain they once caused. She had forgiven, but she hadn't forgotten. And most importantly, she had risen above it. Her parents bowed their heads, not in defeat, but in realization. The daughter they thought they had pushed down was now standing taller than they could ever have imagined. The girl they once measured in dollars had turned herself into something priceless. As Lorado left the gathering, her steps were light, her heart steady. And as her figure disappeared into the night, the closing narration whispered. They tried to count her worth in rent, but she learned her value could build an empire. Sometimes rejection isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of becoming unstoppable. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Hit that follow button for more powerful stories of resilience and triumph. Red Heart Flex Biceps. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that pain can become power. And comment, "Rise," if you believe nothing can stop you when you know your worth. Sparkles Fire.